A rancher buys a cabin for 12 cents at auction. The whole town looks at him with pity like he just signed his own death warrant. When he arrives at the property, he finds a body hanging at the gate. An Apache woman, towering and powerful, left there as a warning. He cuts her down. And that's when everything changes. If this story reminded you what courage looks like, leave a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. That morning, the entire town of Liberty gathered in front of the old courthouse. A cabin and a piece of land roughly 12 acres. About 5 hectares were up for auction. The starting price, 12 cents. The crowd murmured, then fell silent. No one moved. The well-heeled traders, the wealthy ranch owners, they all stood frozen like statues. Only Gideon Hale, a rough-around-the-edges rancher with dust-worn clothes, slowly raised his hand. 12 cents. His hoarse voice rang out. Every head turned. But instead of envy, what filled their eyes was pity, as if the man had just stepped willingly into a trap with no way out. "Do I hear anything higher?" the auctioneer called out, his voice echoing awkwardly. No one answered. The gavel came down. Thud. The cabin now belonged to Gideon Hale. On the horseback ride back, Gideon could still feel those eyes trailing him, like they were whispering a final warning times. Do not go there. But Gideon had nothing left to lose. A 12-cent cabin with land, a well, and an old barn, just enough to start again with his scrawny herd of cattle. The dirt road led into sparse woods. In the distance, the cabin's wooden gate stood quietly among tall grass. Gideon pulled the reins, his heart sinking slightly. Hanging at the gate was a body. It was an Apache woman. But not just any woman. She was enormous, taller and broader than any man Gideon had ever seen. Her shoulders were wide, her legs so long they nearly touched the ground, even strung up from the overhead beam. Her face was smeared with dust and blood. Her eyes were still cracked open, trembling in search of breath. Gideon tightened his grip on his knife and stepped quickly toward the gate. The 12-cent cabin he'd thought was a lucky break was now revealing a secret far more terrifying than any whisper ever told. What would you feel if you were the one to witness such a scene? Tell me in the comments below. The bright steel knife sliced clean through the rope. The girl's heavy body collapsed like a felled tree, forcing Gideon to step back, his knees sinking into the dirt. He was a man used to wrangling wild bulls on the open range, but he'd never caught the full weight of a woman built with such sheer strength and muscle. She lay still on the dry grass, breathing in ragged bursts, her broad chest heaving like it might burst open. Gideon tore a strip from his old shirt and wrapped it around the raw, bleeding rope burned on her neck. His hands trembled slightly. He couldn't tell if it was from the strain or the strangeness of holding a life this mighty in his arms. "Hang on, girl," Gideon muttered, his voice rough like gravel under a boot heel. Her dark eyes cracked open deep and burning with fury and pain. She tried to speak in Apache, but he couldn't understand a word. Still, he recognized that look. It was a plea for life. He reached for the cowhide canteen at his hip and dribbled a few drops of water onto her cracked lips. Her throat moved faintly, and her breathing started to steady. Gideon crouched beside her, glancing up at the cabin's gate. The rope mark was still etched in the beam. Dried blood smeared across the weathered gray wood, a scene left behind, like a warning to anyone foolish enough to step near. He swore under his breath. This 12-cent cabin was no bargain. It was a trap. As the sun dipped low, Gideon dragged the girl into the cabin. The little wooden house was thick with dust, its windows boarded shut. But the floor was solid, and cold ashes still lingered in the stove. It didn't feel like a place left untouched for 15 years. As the town rumors had claimed, he laid her down on a worn wooden table and pulled a blanket over her shoulders. In silence, Gideon studied her face. She wasn't a stranger. He'd heard stories at the fur trading posts. Naili, granddaughter of Chief Whitehawk, warrior blood, Toweringtol. Just like the legend said, but what was she doing strung up at the gate of this cabin? And who would be cruel enough to do that to the granddaughter of an Apache chief? Gideon stepped out onto the porch, squinting into the fading light. Far off, at the edge of the woods, he saw a rider on horseback. The man wore a wide-brimmed hat trimmed with silver that caught the last rays of sunlight. He didn't approach. He didn't ride away. He just stood there, like a sentinel. When their eyes met, the rider turned sharply and vanished into the trees. A cold shiver ran down Gideon's spine. The town had looked at him with pity. This cabin held more than a curse. Someone was watching, waiting, and now he'd pulled a living witness down from death's noose. Inside, Naeli stirred. Her voice was rough, barely a whisper, but one English word came through danger. They will come back. Gideon clenched his calloused hands. This worn-out rancher had never wanted to be part of someone else's fight, but with a 12-cent cabin and a dying giant of a girl now in his care, he knew his days of peace were over. That night, Gideon barely slept. Inside the small cabin, flickering firelight from the wood stove danced across cracked wooden walls. The giant Apache girl lay wrapped in blankets, occasionally groaning, her eyes fluttering open, then slipping shut again. Every time she stirred, the old wooden bed creaked like it was about to snap in two. Gideon sat beside her, his Winchester rifle within reach. He'd grown used to prairie wolves, cattle thieves, and countless lonely nights beneath the stars. But now a different kind of unease throbbed behind his temples. Who in their right mind would hang a giant girl at the gate like some sick spectacle, and why had the whole town stayed silent? As dawn broke, Gideon knew he had to ride into town. Nayeli needed medicine, clean water, and fresh bandages. He left her inside, locked the door, and took the dirt path back to Liberty. When he stepped into the general store, a strange tension hung in the air. Conversation stopped. A few women pretended to browse fabric, but their eyes kept darting toward him. Gideon walked straight to the counter and pulled a few coins from his pocket. I need bandages, antiseptic, and some food. The storekeeper, a wiry man with trembling hands, quietly packed the supplies without a word. He set the bag on the counter, and with a whisper barely above a breath, he asked, "The cabin at Crow's Gate?" Gideon gave a slow nod. The entire store seemed to hold its breath. An old woman dropped her sewing basket. Spools of thread rolled across the wooden floor. Just then, the back door swung open. A tall man stepped in, his wide-brimmed hat rimmed with silver catching the light. It was him the rider Gideon had seen watching from the forest's edge. His gaze was sharp as a blade, his calloused hand resting near the grip of his gun. Fletcher Knox. He introduced himself, voice smooth as polished wood. Heard you made an interesting little purchase. Gideon said nothing. He gave a curt nod, his steel-gray eyes cold. Fletcher dropped a leather pouch onto the counter. It landed with a heavy thud, the unmistakable clink of metal inside. $500. That's thousands more than what you paid. Hand the cabin over to me tonight. The store went still. The shopkeeper flinched, dropping a glass jar of preserves. It shattered across the floor. Everyone in that room knew what that cabin was. And now they were waiting to hear what Gideon would say. Gideon's hand tightened on the saddle strap slung over his shoulder. His steely eyes locked on Fletcher. $500 for a rotting shack. You must be buying something else. Fletcher smiled, but it was a smile cold as forged steel. I'm buying your good sense. That cabin is not for a man who wants to live long. In that moment, Gideon could hear the fearful murmurs around him. Fletcher's words weren't just a warning. They were a death sentence, spoken plain and direct to his face. By the time Gideon returned to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the distant mountain range. He carried a heavy sack in one hand, Fletcher Knox's cold warning still echoing in his mind. His horse let out a soft snort as they approached the gate, the same gate where a body had hung just the day before. Gideon glanced up. The rope had been cut, but the dried blood still stained the wood. A chill crept down his spine. Inside, the flicker of the stove's fire cast golden shadows across the cabin's wooden walls. Naeli, the giant Apache girl, was awake. She sat leaning against the wall, her deep black eyes fixed on Gideon. In the dim light, her form came into full view. Broad warrior shoulders, long arms, powerful muscles laced with bruises. A fierce blend of raw beauty and brutal violence. You saved me, she said, her English broken but clear. Gideon set the bag down and poured her a cup of water. I just couldn't stand to see a human being treated like an animal. Naeli drank slowly, each sip deliberate. Then she spoke again, her words slicing the air like a blade. I am the granddaughter of White Hawk, chief of the Apache. They captured me to force our tribe to give up our land. This cabin is a message. Gideon frowned. A message. She nodded, her large hand clutching the edge of the blanket. They hung me at the gate to make a point. This cabin used to belong to a white man named Samuel Hartwell. He found forged land documents, proof that traders and judges had sold stolen ground. He hid the evidence here, and they killed him. Gideon felt the weight of her words settle in his chest like ash. And those papers, they might still be here. Naeli looked around the room. Her gaze drifted toward the center of the wooden floor. I don't know, but they believe so. And me, I was just a hostage, meant to keep the tribe silent. Outside, the wind howled through the rotting boards, carrying faint sounds of hammering. Someone was setting up camp nearby. Gideon peered through the narrow window slit and spotted shadows of horses moving through the darkness. Fletcher hadn't been bluffing. He'd sent men to watch. Gideon turned back. His eyes met hers. In those deep black eyes, the fire had returned. Not the hopeless flicker of a dying soul, but the blaze of Apache warrior blood. You saved me, Naeli said, her voice stronger. Now, so now you must fight with me. If not, we will both end up hanging at that gate. Gideon clenched his jaw, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his rifle. He was just a weary rancher looking for a quiet place to settle with his scrawny cattle. But now this 12-cent cabin had become a gateway into a storm of blood and fire. Thank you for being here. If this story stirred something in you, memories of old days, dusty evenings, the echo of hooves pounding in your chest, go ahead and subscribe to my channel so that every day we can sit together again. And I'll tell you another story from the West. Night fell fast, like a velvet curtain drawn tight across the prairie. Gideon sat by the window, his Winchester laid across his knees, eyes fixed on the blackness beyond the gate. The fire in the stove had died down, leaving only faint embers casting Nayeli's shadow across the cracked wooden wall. She was sitting up fully now, her eyes glowing in the dark like a flame refusing to die. From the distance came the sound of hooves, heavy, slow, and rhythmic like a funeral drum. Gideon squinted. Silhouettes lined the hilltop. Torches burned bright, and the wind carried the raspy laughter of men. Then a voice rang out, cold as a blade. "Gideon Hale, come out and talk like a man. That cabin ain't yours." Fletcher Knox stepped from the shadows, his silver-rimmed hat gleaming in the firelight. Behind him stood nearly a dozen riders, guns slung at their hips, eyes gleaming like predators on the hunt. Gideon opened the door and stepped onto the porch. He didn't hide his rifle, but he held it firm. His stare itse, bit late for a tea visit. "Ain't it?" Fletcher let out a dry chuckle, his voice echoing across the clearing. "I offered you $500 for that cabin. That offer's gone. What we need is inside that house. Hand it over." You still walk away, breathing. Nayeli appeared behind Gideon, towering like a phantom in the firelight, even wrapped in an old blanket. She stood tall and unyielding. The men on horseback flinched. The image of a girl once hanged at the gate, now standing proud on the porch like a curse risen from the grave. "You tried to kill me." Her voice came rough but powerful. "Because I know the truth. But my blood won't buy you peace." Fletcher narrowed his eyes, his hand halfway to his pistol, then lowered it slowly. "Tough girl. But you see, Gideon, you're holding on to a wounded wolf. She's dragging you into a bloodbath. Let her go. Step aside and keep your life." Gideon turned to look at Nayeli. In that moment, he saw something in her eyes, not fear, but belief. Alone Rancher, a giant Apache girl. Two misfits standing against a pack of wolves. He spat in the dirt. "I paid for this cabin. It's mine. And anyone who lays a hand on this woman will pay in blood." Silence stretched tight like a drawn bowstring, then the cold clatter of metal. Fletcher raised his hand, signaling his men. Rifles slid from holsters, catching torchlight. Gideon stepped back and pulled Nayeli inside. His voice dropped low. "Take that revolver. Tonight we fight." Outside, hoofbeats thundered louder. The field around the cabin lit up in flames. The storm had arrived. The heavy pounding on the wooden door sounded like a coffin being nailed shut. Then came the first hail of bullets screaming through the air, tearing holes through the cabin walls. Splinters flew like sparks. Gideon tackled Nayeli to the floor, and his Winchester roared back, blasting one of the attackers off the fence line. Gunsmoke thickened the small cabin like a fog. Every time Gideon fired, he heard the curses and snarls of men outside. They weren't holding back. They meant to drown the cabin in blood. Nayeli, though still weak, clutched the Colt he'd handed her. Her large hands trembled but held firm. Her fingers squeezed the trigger. Bung! Another man dropped at the gate, his body falling exactly where she herself had once hung. The cabin gate had now become a boundary marked in blood. "There's too many of them," Gideon growled, sweat and powder dust streaking his brow. He flipped a wooden table on its side as a barricade, slamming more rounds into his Winchester. Outside, Fletcher's voice bellowed, "Burn it. Burn the cabin and burn them with it." The torch sailed onto the dry straw roof. Flames burst into the sky, golden light flickering in Nayeli's black eyes. She gritted her teeth, braced her hands, and stood tall, her towering frame casting a shadow over Gideon. "They will not have this cabin," she said, her voice raw but resolute. "And they will not have me." Just then, from far across the prairie, a war horn blew low and deep, like thunder rolling through the hills. And then, beneath the moonlight, came the silhouette. Hundreds of Apache riders, White Hawk's tribe. They formed a wall of horse and steel, their spears flashing, war cries ripping through the night. Fletcher's men panicked. Some glanced back, terror on their faces as the full force of the tribe stormed forward like a desert sandstorm. Fletcher cursed and drew his revolver. He kicked his horse, charging toward the cabin, desperate to finish it before everything fell apart. But Gideon was already waiting. He stepped out onto the porch. His Winchester fired. The bullet whistled past Fletcher's silver hat, nearly knocking him from the saddle. Nayeli stood beside him, a wall of muscle and fury, and shouted in the Apache tongue. Her call was answered by a thunder of voices as the warriors closed around the cabin. A flaming arrow streaked through the air, striking a torch in one of the mercenaries' hands. It exploded into flame. Fire swallowed the fence line. Apache horses surged in, completing the circle. Fletcher yanked his reins to flee, but it was too late. The native riders moved in like blades of steel, swallowing his entire hired gang. Gideon stood on the burning porch, sweat and ash covering his face. Beside him, Nayeli loomed like a mountain shadow, her eyes blazing. They had survived the night. But Gideon knew this was only the beginning. The cabin's secret was still buried, and whoever was pulling Fletcher's strings would be far more dangerous. Dawn painted the prairie blood red. Smoke still curled from the roof of the cabin, but the fire had been put out by buckets of water brought by the Apache tribe. The bodies of horses and fallen men lay scattered around the fence line, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and scorched ash. Gideon sat slumped on the porch steps, breathing heavy, his calloused hands still trembling from the blood-soaked night. In front of him knelt Chief White Hawk, long silver hair flowing, eyes old but burning bright, as he wrapped his arms around Nayeli. The giant girl bowed her head, her powerful arms clinging to her grandfather. Tears, mixed with soot and sweat, as they streamed down her sun-darkened cheeks. "My granddaughter lives, but the enemy will return," White Hawk said, his voice a low thunder. He looked Gideon in the eye. "This cabin hides something they want, buried forever." Gideon turned his gaze to the scorched house. He remembered what Nayeli had told him the night before, that Samuel Hartwell had hidden the real documents. He stepped inside, knelt on the smoke-stained floor. In the center of the room, he spotted something odd, a square patch of planks sealed tightly with black stone hard resin. "Here," Gideon whispered. White Hawk nodded and signaled. Two warriors stepped forward with axes. Heavy strikes echoed through the cabin, cracking the resin, splitting the wood. At last, the floorboards gave way, revealing a dark hollow beneath. Gideon reached in and pulled out a dusty iron chest and a heavy leather pouch. When the lid creaked open, every eye locked on it. Inside were scrolls, lump dates, and government seals. Each paper bore a familiar signature, Judge William Crane, and beside it, a bold red stamp, Governor Marcus Webb. Nayeli clenched her jaw. They used forged documents, sold our tribe's land to 10, 20 different buyers. Hartwell found out. He tried to expose them, and they killed him. Gideon flipped through more papers, payment ledgers, names of those who had taken bribes, judges, sheriffs, even prominent ranch owners. The sums were massive, tens of thousands of dollars. The air grew heavy. Every word on those pages was a blade aimed at the throats of the powerful across 3 counties. Now you understand. White Hawk said quietly. Fletcher was just a hound. The masterminds are Crane and Webb. They will not stop. They will send soldiers. They will burn this place down. Kill anyone who knows. Gideon clenched his fists. His 12-cent cabin had turned out to be a graveyard of secrets, and a spark that could set fire to an entire rotten empire. He looked at Nayeli, still shaking but proud, then to White Hawk, his old eyes heavy with the sorrow of a stolen people. They wanted to silence you, Gideon said, voice hard as stone. But now I know the truth too. And I swear this cabin will never be a grave again. That afternoon, the prairie wind rose fierce and wild. Dark clouds gathered overhead, heralding a coming storm. Gideon tightened the saddle straps, Winchester slung over his shoulder, while Nayeli and the Apache warriors set up a defensive perimeter around the cabin. Everyone knew the forces of Crane and Webb could arrive at any moment. The sound of hooves thundered from the distance loud, relentless, like rolling drums. Hundreds of riders appeared on the horizon, cloaks billowing, rifles glinting. At the front rode Judge William Crane, face hard as stone. Flanked by Governor Webb's soldiers, they stopped at the cabin gate, the same place where Nayeli's body had once hung. Crane called out, his voice booming, hand over the iron chest in that Apache girl, and we'll spare your life. Gideon Hale, you're just a poor cowhand. Don't let 12 cents become your tomb. Gideon stepped out onto the porch, eyes steady. He raised the stack of papers pulled from the chest. These documents are enough to hang both you and your governor. You think I'll bow down? Murmurs rippled through the crowd of riders. Some began to shift uneasily at the mention of Webb. They too knew betrayal might soon turn on them. Crane snarled and shouted the order to attack. Gunfire erupted. Bullets ripped through the air. The Apache responded with a storm of arrows and battle cries that shook the earth. The fight exploded right at the cabin's gate. Gideon dropped the first attacker, then turned to fell the second. Nayeli stood tall at the entrance, her powerful arms wielding the Colt with thunderous force, each shot like a crack of lightning. The fire of battle raged. Webb's riders faltered against the fierce coordination of Gideon and the tribe. Confusion spread, and many fled, leaving Crane alone, still defiant. He charged toward the cabin, gun raised at Gideon, but Nayeli was already there, blocking the gate. Her massive hand swung up, knocking the pistol clean from Crane's grip. He collapsed in the dirt, eyes wide as he stared at the papers in Gideon's hand. Justice comes, Gideon growled, his Winchester aimed squarely at Crane's chest. No matter how many cabins you burn, Crane was bound and handed over to the warriors. The evidence from the iron chest was delivered by White Hawk and Gideon directly to the territorial marshal. 1 week later, Governor Webb and his accomplices were marched out in handcuffs before the public. News spread like wildfire. All 3 counties trembled. The 12-cent cabin was no longer a place of hanging, but a symbol of justice. Nayeli, the chief's granddaughter, was hailed as the one who returned from the dead. And Gideon, the once forgotten rancher, became a hero, not just for his steady aim, but because he had chosen to stand on the side of truth. Years later, when the prairie wind whispered through the grasslands, one could still see a dim light glowing inside the cabin. Gideon sat on the porch, Naeli by his side, both of them quietly watching the old gate. Where once hung a noose, now stood a wooden sign with just one word, times freedom. Now listen here. Out in that wild land, a poor man spent just 12 cents to buy a rundown cabin. But what he got was not wood, not land, but the burden of an entire generation. A girl hung at the gate, blood-stained papers, and a truth the whole town feared. Sometimes life is just like that 12-cent cabin. You think you're buying a cheap place to rest, but you end up walking straight into a storm. You believe you're choosing something small, just for yourself. But fate demands you stand for something far greater. Gideon was just a rough old rancher, unnoticed by most. But when he cut the rope from the neck of that Apache girl, he didn't just save a life. He saved what was left of his own humanity. Sometimes, one small act of courage is all it takes to spark the path to justice. And that, perhaps, is the greatest truth this story holds. Justice always begins with the choice of an ordinary man. You don't have to be a governor. You don't have to be a general. You just have to be willing to say no to what is wrong and stand beside those who are too often left alone. Even a broke rancher can shift the weight of an entire land. Out west, where gunfire and dust decide fate, the one thing that endures is not gold, not land deeds. What remains is the voice of what is right. And once that voice is raised, even the wolves step back. Once again, I am truly honored to have shared this with you. Tell me what this story meant to you. Leave a comment below. Hit like if this story moved you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more gripping tales of the Wild West. This story is rooted in the harsh realities of the Old West, a time when land, power, and truth collided in ways that tested ordinary people to their core. It's a reminder that justice doesn't come from titles. It comes from choices. 5 takeaway points. Point 1. One hum. One hum hum. One hum hum. One hum. One hum. One hum. One hum. Sometimes the cheapest price carries the highest cost. Gideon bought a cabin for 12 cents less than the price of a drink. But what he actually bought was a fight he never asked for. A body at the gate. A town full of secrets. And men willing to kill to keep those secrets buried. The auction wasn't a bargain. It was a test. And he walked right into it. Point 2. The people who stay silent are often more dangerous than the ones who threaten you. When Gideon walked into that general store, conversation stopped. Women pretended to browse fabric. The storekeeper's hands trembled. They all knew what that cabin was. They all knew what happened to people who went there. But not one of them warned him. Fear doesn't just stop you from acting, it turns you into an accomplice. Point 3. One act of decency can pull you into a war you never wanted. Gideon cut the rope and gave Naeli water. He didn't think about politics or land disputes or Apache chiefs. He just couldn't stand to see a human being treated like an animal. That single choice made him a target. Fletcher Knox showed up with $500 and a death threat. Doing the right thing doesn't keep you safe. It just shows you who you really are. Point 4. The powerful will always try to buy you before they try to kill you. Fletcher dropped a leather pouch on that counter, $500 for a 12-cent cabin. He smiled and said he was buying Gideon's good sense. It wasn't an offer. It was a test to see if Gideon could be controlled. When you can't be bought, that's when they come for you with torches and guns. Integrity costs more than most people are willing to pay. Point 5. Secrets buried in the ground have a way of rising to the surface. That cabin wasn't cursed. It was hiding proof forged land deeds, bribes, stolen territory, names of judges and governors who sold an entire people for profit. Samuel Hartwell tried to expose it, and they killed him. Nayeli was hung at the gate as a warning. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Eventually, someone digs it up. And when they do, the whole rotten empire comes down.